So we just talked about sort of the scope of this issue. We're going to talk about what can be done now. I actually want to start with Jorge. Jorge, I know you work a lot in this arena. What is being done to stem devaluation? And also, what does the enforcement regime around this kind of stuff look like under the current administration relative to previous administrations?
Sure. I'm happy to help kind of lay that out there. I think that most people in the room, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this research, Brookings and Gallup. It's really important. And thank you for having this kind of conversation. I think that most of the conversations that we should be having on this subject need to start off the way this conversation started. I agree fully that we can't really separate the history of redlining, the history of segregation, and how the government and private actors played into that. And we can't really separate that from where we are today. Doing so would, I think, we'd come up with the same results that we've come up with for some time now. So in terms of the administration now and what they're doing, I can say that most people in the room here have a good sense of what this administration thinks about the fair lending and the fair housing laws on the books in this country. But I can point to a few specifics and kind of compare that to the previous administration. But I'll start first by saying that I think that the previous administration did some of the most important fair housing and fair lending work that has been done, and to fully implement the Fair Housing Act, certainly. And that plays out in a couple of ways. I think the most relevant one for this conversation is through the promulgation of the disparate impact rule under the Fair Housing Act. And that is an important rule because it basically is a doctrine that has been adopted and used for decades, that was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 2015, that says that you can actually make claims against an institution, a person, whoever it is, for discrimination that occurs that isn't necessarily intentional, but is because of a policy or practice that has a disparate negative impact on particular communities that are protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. So people of color is one category. That was a really important development because it really helps standardize the way that these kinds of claims are brought up, and these kinds of claims are the kinds of claims that really help change systemic problems in the market that we need to continue to bring. And so, for example, some of the cases during the Obama administration that included disparate impact analysis were the big fair lending cases against Countrywide and Wells Fargo. Some of the most important cases that really brought to light what a number of advocates across the country doing this work were already aware of, that in fact, like what was mentioned earlier, predatory products were being peddled to communities of color at higher prices, and especially to people who qualified for better products. And so, I will kind of set that as kind of the framework for what the previous administration was doing. And with this current administration, I think that you see a lot of intentional reversal of the policies that the previous administration really advanced. And I'll focus on a few different areas. So at HUD, I previously mentioned that the disparate impact rule is a really important piece of our enforcement infrastructure. The current administration, both at the Department of the Treasury and at HUD, have suggested to change the disparate impact rule to essentially weaken it in certain aspects. There was recently an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking for the disparate impact rule, and one of the questions was, essentially, can we have safe harbors? Is there a way that we can, make this easier for the businesses, on the business side of things? And the proposition that we can have a safe harbor for discrimination, I think, is preposterous. And I think that we, need to continue to say things like that. That's one example of what this administration, views as a priority for them. I'll say that at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I think a lot of people are aware that they've had a really tumultuous last several months, last couple of years, really since they started. And the reason is because they're the first agency that is coming at regulatory, it's the first agency that's creating regulation and overseeing a market for the purposes of ensuring that those products that market provides are safe for the consumer first and not for the business itself. And so that's really important, and that's why it's been the subject of so much animosity by several industries. So earlier this year, the CFPB, under the leadership of Mick Mulvaney, essentially stripped the Office of Fair Lending of its enforcement powers and made it an educational office. And by doing so, it essentially
make it an educational office. What does that mean?
in the sense that they can conduct they can do programming to provide more financial more education to the public and to the industry about how to comply with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and other fair lending laws.
But they don't have any sanction
But
power.
they don't have any, exactly, and the decision to take an enforcement action now rests with Eric Blankenstein, who within the last couple of months has come under fire for writing that he did as a law student that included several incendiary racist remarks and perspectives. And so this is the person who is determining whether or not a fair lending violation is going to be acted upon by the agency that's supposed to act upon those kinds of violations. I'll also say that when it comes to the OCC, most recently, the OCC came up with a notice of proposed, an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks to change the way that CRA examinations are done. And one of the things that they want to do is just completely change the way that assessments are done to just have one single ratio to determine whether or not products and services are being provided. And this is problematic for a number of reasons because it delocalizes the consideration of how that bank, how that service provider is providing services in a particular geography. I'll also say that when it comes to the Department of Justice, we see that based on their September 2018 report to Congress on enforcement of ECOA, they have currently 22 cases open. Some of them, it's unclear how many, but some of the subjects that those cases deal with have much to do with redlining. They have much to do with predatory loans. They deal with mortgage underwriting standards, and I believe they also deal with steering. But it's unclear when those cases were first started. So we don't know where they are in the process, which means that they could be from the previous administration. And the most recent settlements under ECOA and fair lending settlements that we've seen, the most prominent ones actually came out before this administration took over. So we see a pattern of enforcement that we've seen before, where this administration chooses to take a step back and enforce the law according to how they want to enforce the law. They're doing fantastic work on sexual harassment, and some of that actually some of that does touch the mortgage process, and that's certainly important, but we believe that this may be at the expense of discrimination that people of color are experiencing in the mortgage market as well.
But you mentioned this is not just a Republican-driven, this sort of rolling back of enforcement is not just about the Trump administration or Republicans.
No, not at all. And this isn't necessarily about, well, it does touch on it. I do want to point out that we have this sort of concept that these fair lending protections are supported by who we think of as progressive people in Congress. But in the just this year, we've had two major votes on legislation that directly relate to the work that we're talking about here. The first was the first time ever that the Congressional Review Act was used to nullify an agency guidance, not an agency rule that went through the rulemaking process, but an agency policy guidance. And that's significant because it sets the stage for all sorts of bulletins or letters to covered entities that really define how the Bureau or the enforcement agency, the department that we're talking about, if they have a guidance that isn't formally in a rule, how they move forward with some of their enforcement and the expectations that the covered entities that those bulletins and letters are intended for actually, how they're supposed to comply with the law. So this CRA vote actually nullified the CFPB's indirect auto lending guidance. And so in 2013, the CFPB came out with an indirect auto lending guidance that basically said indirect auto lenders are liable for disparate impact violations under ECOA. And this set off a firestorm. The auto lending industry vehemently opposed this measure, and then every single year from then on started working with members of Congress to try and reverse this. The CRA, the Congressional Review Act vote on the indirect auto lending guidance was supported by 11 Democrats in the House, and by essentially having a resolution of disapproval. What this means is that we will now need an act of Congress to achieve the same policy that the CRA vote nullified. So that's the direction that we're headed in. So we're losing ground in some of those areas.
Tahira, can you talk a little bit about the way this looks on the ground? I mean, you work with homeowners in Detroit, which has famously dealt with issues of devaluation related to the population. So can you talk a little bit about what this looks like on the ground for everyday people?
Absolutely. Greetings from Detroit. Thank you for this really powerful study and research. It really backs up a lot of the work that all of us are trying to do on the ground. So I'm coming from a city that is 80% African American. It is a city that was built on the backs of a lot of folks in the auto industry through the migration of African Americans to the north. And so African Americans in Detroit have seen a lot of wealth over time. And very interesting to hear some of the comments from the earlier panel about some of that wealth being stripped. So if we are a city of around 700,000 people, 80% African American, and 67% home ownership were the numbers that we were really impressed with over the years. That wealth has been stripped. We are now less than 40-something% home ownership, and it's just a wave, different waves of, I would say, systematic racial lens and racism in terms of mortgage foreclosures and foreclosures for property tax. And in Detroit, we pay some of the highest tax or insurance for our automobiles. And so there's just...
You went from 2/3 homeownership
two-thirds,
to about 4 and 10.
less than half.
Over what period of time?
Well, you talked a bit about redlining from earlier, but we saw redlining in 2009, 2010. Banks weren't coming back into Detroit. There were a lot of cash deals that happened if you wanted to be a homeowner. And so we saw a lot of issues around the people that were able to keep their homes. Those folks did not have first mortgages. Those folks that are living in Detroit now, some of their big issues are deferred maintenance on their homes, and they couldn't get capital because due to the devaluation, and I'll just call it ground zero in terms of we've gone through bankruptcy, we've gone through a lot of different waves of issues in terms of financial, I would call it crisis for Detroit. So a lot of our work has been trying to figure out how do we bring mortgage capital, how do we bring home improvement loans to Detroit. And so we do have a product called the 0% Home Repair Program with the City of Detroit and backed by Bank of America, which is a public-private partnership. And so we have to look at other ways to try to bring capital. We're able to bring up to $25,000 to homeowners, but I tell you, the wave of what they need is unsurmountable. We had about 4,000 people inquire. We've only been able to help about 1,500 of those applications. When you talk about credit scores, we wanted to make sure that credit was not an issue, so we made our credit score very low, subprime, 560 was the credit score. What we found, though, the profile is that most people don't have a first mortgage. They are able to really borrow the maximum amount. Their credit score is 717, and they still couldn't get a loan for their home. And so we're seeing most of these folks have income around $50,000. So not a ton of income, but they are very proud people. They have bought into the American dream. They are still holding on to their properties. And we think that this particular program and others that really bring capital back to African American communities is important. I'll just make one other point, and that is we are a city of 140 square miles. Not tiny, but a good-sized city. And right now we have investments in 7 miles of it. So think about the 133 miles in terms of where people of color are living across the footprint, and the kind of work and products and opportunities that we need to bring back to the city. So when you talk about discrimination of neighborhoods, I would say we have a discrimination of an entire city. And so we're really working, a lot of people, a lot of philanthropic folks, corporate folks are coming and really trying to figure out what needs to happen for Detroit. So I don't want to leave you with this is a bleak conversation, but I want you to know that this is a stark, drastic, I think, example of your work and where we need to go in terms of opportunities and policies.
For the people who survived the depopulation and the downturn in Detroit, I know Elena was talking about this before, but the importance of passing down these homes to people, to their children. How do people describe their motivations for holding on to their properties when their properties were sort of tanking in value? You're possibly passing down property that wouldn't be worth very much to your child or to the next generation. How are the people in Detroit describing that to you when you talk to them?
Well, I think there's a level of disappointment, but I think there's still the thought that that the opportunities that are coming back and the investors that are coming back in Detroit are going to reach them, and so they're holding on to their properties, I think, with that thought. And I think that in terms of the way that we're looking at people moving back into Detroit, that some folks are thinking that, hey, I've got this property and how close am I to some areas that have commercial business development happening, and maybe I should hold on to my property as people are coming back, because we are trying to obviously stabilize our city, but also really promoting inclusive growth and trying to grow our city. So I think people are in a holding pattern as much as they can be to see what comes next.
Jair, I mean, you work in investment. How are you thinking about investing into these devalued black neighborhoods?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. This is such a breath of fresh air to be able to talk about these hard issues. I grew up in Washington, D.C. My father was deep into the civil rights movement. My mother was very much into economic development in Latin America. That perspective, that grounding really opened up my eyes as I went into the real estate world, because it is filled with obstacles, historical situations of which that we have really desperate times. But we felt like we could make a difference in neighborhoods, and we have over the last 20 years. We've done it in many ways, whether it's direct investments into neighborhoods that have been underserved, but also trying to make a difference in the other components that are driving the devaluation. You talked about schools and neighborhoods. You talked about primary care facilities. You talk about other things that actually start breaking down some of these disparities. So we've been working there, but we have to make sure that we understand through the historical context, and we lift up our eyes about where the long-term African-American homeownership has been and where the new African-American homeownership will be after the Great Recession and the new home buyers. And what we have to realize is that for a lot of the historical reasons that we've discussed, a lot of the black homeownership neighborhoods have been low-density neighborhoods that are not high on with the high walkability. They're not necessarily close to job centers. They may not have a commercial corridor. And so you're working with a different tapestry than you are in a neighborhood that is right next to its central business district that had a lot of African-American population, but rental. And therefore, the change happened there first, and the toppling of those places and the toppling of African-Americans in those places happened faster. So if we go back to some of these neighborhoods, and I'll give you one example, the Penn Branch neighborhood in Washington, D.C. is east of the river, but is one of the most stable middle-class neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. Submarket median income is above 50,000. It's about 60,000 people, but the density is very low. Within a half-mile radius of the center of it, there's only 5,000 people. And so when you look at things like commercial activity, which is one of the ways to drive change, you have to start asking the question, well, how does the math work? And so we have,
Doesn't make sense to
and
build a
does it make
business.
sense? Does a business thrive there? And so, part of my job here today is to unpack some of that. So I'll give you an example. So 20 plus years ago, Michael Porter at Harvard Business School did a culmination of a bunch of things, but really put a name around the competitive inner city. And it was a very simple thesis. For the 20 years prior, to satisfy the baby boomer customer, retailers went to low-density places, typically in the suburbs, with very high incomes. Because they said, low density, high incomes, thriving business. Michael Porter said, high density, lower income still equals a thriving business because you have lots of people, lots of density, and that spurred the investment in urban neighborhoods, starting with the pension funds, the great titans like Victor McFarlane, Richmond McCoy, others who went into Los Angeles, Cabrini Green, in Chicago, other places, because they had high density, lower incomes, but still thriving businesses. That came out of a political action, Maxine Waters, and really came out of Rodney King and a lot of other things. That doesn't really equate to some of the neighborhoods I'm talking about, including Penn Branch. Low-density, middle-class neighborhood doesn't get you the same outcomes, economic outputs, and therefore the same investment.
How do you incentivize people to move to a place like that? Businesses to move.
So I'll lay the groundwork. So in Penn Branch, let's use one category, food away from home and grocery. Combine those two. How much are you spending on that a week? Let's make it really simple. We've been using billions of dollars all over these panels. Let's make it really simple. $500 a month. In Penn Branch, I'll even do it down to the week. In Penn Branch, folks are spending $86 a week. In U Street, people are spending $186 a week. In DuPont Circle here, people are spending $206 a week.
Just on food?
Just on food.
Okay.
Away and at home. So the difference in DuPont Circle, you have 22,000 people within a half a mile. In Shaw, 14th Street, you have 32,000 people within a half a mile. In Penn Branch, you have 5,000 people within a half a mile.
So this is a question of not having access to I mean, there's not places around to buy food from, or is it like
No, it's really a question of who's going to invest when the population is low and the spending is average. There's another neighborhood in D.C. that is the fastest growing neighborhood in terms of quick homeownership appreciation, Petworth. Petworth. They're only spending $68 per person, but they've got 19,000 people within half a mile.
So what is happening there?
So what's happening is you've got a mix of density, you got a mix of population density because you're near a metro station, and you have a decent amount of spending that's happening. And so you'll get restaurants, you'll get commercial activities, you'll get a Safeway, you'll get a CVS, you'll get the commercial activity that kind of feeds it and then also starts propping up home values for all the home ownership that's there. So in a neighborhood like Penn Branch, you have to sell a different dream to a retailer because there's only 5,000 people who live in that neighborhood. So for us, we've been trying to get a grocer to come to that neighborhood because it's a food desert, and they say there's not enough people. And they're right. They still might be biased, but they're right. So we have to sell them that it's a commuter location. And there are 27,000 people that are driving by every day coming in from the suburbs, more drivable suburban places. Well, then we have to talk to the city and say, well, we need a big parking garage to take care of those customers in order to get the population to the retailers up to 20,000. And now it starts to make sense. So we're going to have to really start to look at some of these historically neighborhoods where it's low density, medium income people. And we'll have to say, do we increase the density? That's very scary to someone who worked in the federal government because they're scared about what's going to happen to them. Or are we going to increase the incomes in the homes? Or both? And when we do that, those policies to be able to maintain the social equity and the place that people want to be in have to be in place so that they don't get overrun by taxes or other things that will create problems. So we have to really look at all these neighborhoods and be intellectually honest about what are the things that are going to create investment. And it's going to be the ability, and commercials are a really easy one, and it runs to the home ownership. We can go through all kinds of other things that get to the other means for investment. But that's one that I think that through that lens, I think we can create better policies and better visions where people say, I'm part of the vision. I think we need to get to 10,000 people in my neighborhood. And I'm okay with that.
So here, I see you nodding your head. I imagine you are dealing with a lot of this in Detroit.
Yeah, I was just going to add, just in terms of small business development, that's a big, big push and need. Although, we do need to definitely change the narrative of how we're approaching big box or other type of investors to come back into neighborhoods. But I think we really need to figure out, looking at this number earlier of 4.4 million black businesses could be supported with the loss and the devalue of what we're seeing in the research. That's really powerful to figure out what kind of businesses need to be in these neighborhoods. And also, they hire people from the neighborhood. And so trying to figure out how to make that connection and access to small business, I think, is crucial. So I just wanted to add that.
I think the lens in which people think about the investments in their neighborhood from a homeownership perspective, from a business perspective, are often very different. And I use this analogy about you think about neighborhoods and you think about real estate investors or developers, and you have to recognize, just like you have 100 types of doctors, you're going to have 100 types of real estate investors and developers. And there's often a set of developers who are like the emergency doctors. They work in very short stints, 0 to 3 years. There are others that are more like your primary care doctor, that are there for long term. Those developers may be there for 5 or 10 years. And then there's speculators and other types of developers that may wait 20 years, 30 years before they do anything. And the bulk of investors are working in that 0 to 3, 0 to 5 year space. That's not going to fix these neighborhoods. And that's 80% of the doctors, 80% of the investors out there. That's a problem. If 10% are working in the 3 to 10 year space and 10% are working in the 0 or the 20 plus space, you got to get those people to these neighborhoods. You got to get investors to Detroit that are willing to wait 20 years before something happens. And that's a much smaller set of doctors. That's a much smaller set of investors and developers to be able to make the change.
Do we want to open this up to questions? Right here. Can you say your name and where you're from?
My name's Barb, and I'm from Colorado. I'm visiting in town, but I find this extraordinarily fascinating. We have more the problem of maintaining affordable housing in the city I'm from. But a question I had from Andre's research, there were a few of those wonderful little green dots. And can you extrapolate something from the green dots to recommend to the red dots?
So the green dots in the data viz were the places that showed the most appreciation.
Yeah, we'll both take a stab. One, I need to always remind people there are a whole lot of poor white people in terrible housing that often puts the green dots in perspective. And I also say this is not to be pessimistic. A green dot doesn't necessarily mean a place is less racist either. There are a number of factors. I'm working with a reporter now. We're just looking at these anomalies, and we found in places like Boston where there are high concentrations of high-income blacks from working at MIT, Harvard, other places near hospitals, and they're highly concentrated in the same environment and surrounded by low-income white folk. And so I don't know, I'm not going to say if there's a positive story to tell, because I think in many cities the stars align where you have a concrete reason why you have blacks in areas where there are, the housing stock is better. But we're still learning from that. That's the report, the model tells a story. Now it's our turn to dig in and discover more. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things there. So one thing that we do know is that segregation is a predictor of the extent of devaluation. It's not a very strong relationship, but we do know that places that tend to be somewhat less devalued do have a bit more racial integration. And then there are other, as Andre was saying, fairly idiosyncratic explanations that unfortunately don't necessarily lend themselves to policy advice. So in one case in the Vero Beach, Sebastian, Florida area, we don't know for sure what's going on there, but that's one of the ones that's the green dot. But I know that there are a lot of vacation homes there. There are a lot of retirement homes in that part of Florida, but other parts of Florida as well. It's got access to the beach, so that may mean there are fairly low value homes that may not be in black neighborhoods because they're just not utilized for much of the year, or because they're for essentially elder care. So I think we're going to try to explore a bit more of what's going on there, but the bottom line is we feel like there's more research to do, and we've got an ambitious agenda ahead of us to try to figure this out.
Right here in the middle. You say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Jessica Ortiz. I'm actually here in the city. I'm a realtor and a real estate investor, particularly in the H Street area. And so I was really taken with your comments about the considerations, the demographic and the density and income considerations that go into commercial development. And the way you described it seems to be sort of this chicken and the egg relationship, which one really comes first. And so I'm interested for, a lot of the neighborhoods where, no commercial development is even being considered. How do you get people to move there when there's no commercial development on the horizon?
So I don't work in single-family homes, but I study the patterns of which people are doing are doing in neighborhoods and investing in neighborhoods. It is a long climb, right? And so we think of neighborhoods in stages, and you just described them, that you have to get to a point where there's enough investment where it kind of works on its own. So in early stage neighborhoods, you need public investment in order to be able to do it. And that public investment can come from buildings, whether it's libraries or schools or other things that show a true investment in that place. On H Street, that public investment was in infrastructure as it related to a streetcar that showed permanency, that also not only put tracks on the street, but it put new street lights, new curbs. All of those are signals to commercial real estate investors and or just mom and pop retail owners that there's been a concerted effort to make this place better. So when you make those early public investments, then it starts to feed on itself. And I always say that there needs to be a variety of investment in neighborhoods. You need a $100 million investment that may come from us, and you need a $10,000 investment that may come from a retail owner, and a $100,000 investment that may come from a single homeowner, or a $50,000 investment to upgrade their home. You need all of those investments happening at the same time to get the flywheel going.
Jorge.
Hello. Okay. This is something I wasn't really planning on talking about, but another thing that this administration is doing that's actually going to really make this more difficult is actually earlier this year they rescinded what's known as the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, and this is a rule that basically implements the second piece of the Fair Housing Act, which is to essentially reverse the harm of the nation's segregation, the patterns of segregation, what that's done to communities of color, and intended to really, and so HUD put out a rule that helps jurisdictions, local governments that receive community development funds on how to figure out how they can comply with this piece of the Fair Housing Act, and also with the goal of making sure that investments are made in communities and those investments are chosen by a process that's informed by the community. So it requires community engagement where people have the opportunity to say, this is what we need in our neighborhood. We have a concentration of low-income housing that's primarily people of color in the same area where lower-performing schools are, in the same area where there's no transportation corridor, in the same area where people here have a hard time getting to their job over there. And bringing people together, bringing city service providers together, local governments, as well as private market players to the same table to develop solutions for how to deal with these issues. And that is intended to make sure that these public investments are actually used in a way that benefit that community and help them and help those communities utilize resources to the best of their ability and for their communities themselves. The rule does a couple of things. It intends to reinvest in community. It helps jurisdictions reinvest in communities, and that's how you can comply with this piece of the Fair Housing Act. But you can also provide mobility options. So for folks who want to move and they want to use, like, let's say, a housing choice voucher, they want to move to a different neighborhood where there's a better school, or their child's needs will be better taken care of. Ideally they should be able to do that, but oftentimes that's very difficult to port a voucher from one community to another. So that's just for context. That's one piece of the AFFH rule. The second piece is this process that helps jurisdictions utilize federal resources in a way that will help determine what kinds of other investments come in and make the communities better for them.
So where does AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, where does that stand now?
It has been rescinded by the Trump administration. The National Fair Housing Alliance and several other civil rights organizations have filed a case against HUD for a number of different failures under regulatory law, as well as the Fair Housing Act. And we're asking right now. We're in the process of asking for a motion. We filed a motion for reconsideration so that the judge can review different information based on a previous bad ruling in the case. So we're working to try and bring it back.
More questions here in the fur lines.
Washington. I'm with the NAACP. Chanel Washington, NAACP New York State Conference. I wanted to ask you guys, I believe it's Miss McCargo. She mentioned appraisals. Could it be that we have a lack of diversity across the nation in that industry? And could that be contributing to not only the devaluation in our well-established black neighborhoods, but also the artificial inflation in our urban communities that's displacing a lot of our poor and medium income black folks?
I think
So,
Elena
I'm sorry.
left.
She did, but I want to speak on that if that's okay. We definitely think in Detroit, and we would say this for other urban cities, that there needs to be an appraisal reform process. We actually don't use appraisals for our product at all. And I think that there's some policy choices that could be made depending on what the product is and what you're trying to do in terms of bringing capital back to investment in core cities. So yes, we would definitely agree with Alana and her comments about the issues around appraisals. And I think we can think about more innovative ways that we could maybe try to get comps or other comparables within certain neighborhoods. And I would just say, because many of our, and I'll just go back to the visual up here of that home that was boarded up. It's so hard if you are a homeowner next to a home like that, in terms of your property is definitely being devalued, and how do you actually sell? How do you get your equity to your heirs? It's just so many issues. So we have to figure out a better way in areas that are really dealing with a lot of blight and vacant properties.
Jorge.
Just to add to that, so the National Fair Housing Alliance is also a private enforcement agency, and one of the things that we've done for years, for the years since the financial crisis, was to basically look at the way that banks that own foreclosed homes treat foreclosed homes in black neighborhoods and how they treat foreclosed homes in white neighborhoods. And what we have found is that across the board, similarly sized homes in similar neighborhoods that shouldn't have difference in treatment, the banks will neglect properties in communities of color, and they will prop up homes in white communities, so much so that in a white community you will see a for sale sign, but in a black community you will see a foreclosure sign and boarded up windows. And this is the same bank operating different processes, operating differently in different communities based on the racial composition of those communities. So it goes beyond just the origination process. It goes beyond just the access to credit. It's fundamentally a system of value.
Gentleman right there with the brown jacket.
My name is Kenneth. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, but I'm studying. My guy. I'm studying intelligence at a graduate school for national security in D.C. There's a lot of like data and research and analysis going on, but there's also like reports of like the buying power of African Americans in the country, which is like at like $1.2, $1.5 trillion. Is that like a number to consider? Because it's like there's money out here, you know what I mean? But is that how does that data, should that data be taken into account in terms of that number being distributed amongst the population of African Americans? Does that number like not mean anything because then you take into account how many, if you divide it amongst all African Americans in the country, does that make it the number smaller than what $1.5 trillion really sounds like when you hear it?
I think your question is very important. We would think that you would localize it to a specific neighborhood or census tract. You take that $1 trillion and you go back to Penn Branch and you say, what's the buying power in Penn Branch? And then you actually look at the behaviors. Because there is a grocery store 2 miles away at the U.S. Capitol. And there is a grocery store 2.5 miles away out in Maryland. And if they're spending their money there, will they change their pattern if you put a grocery store in their neighborhood? That actually props up their values because that grocery store that's by the Capitol is helping someone else's property value. That restaurant that's down by the Capitol is helping someone else's restaurant. But so right now, there used to be $1 trillion of tax revenue that was leaving the district out to the suburbs in retail sales tax. And you wonder why some of the neighborhoods weren't working and didn't have commercial strips. Because people were just making choices, and this was a small enough place where a 15-minute drive felt okay. But it makes a difference in your homeowner value if you keep making that 15-minute drive. If you keep buying your broom from Amazon instead of the local, yes, you have to pay a little bit more, but if you're a homeowner, that little bit more is helping your home value. Correct. You're going to have to change the behaviors with the dollar I have, the $10 I have. I got to make choices with it. And what choices am I going to make? I mean, we all know what the power of compounding, right? So that compounding is important when you're saving, and that compounding is important to that retailer when you're putting it in his pocket as well. So
I think we are out of time.
We're out of time. Sorry.
Matt, question?
Conversation. I think we're on. Can you hear me? Well, and I'm going to close with this. First of all, I want to thank B. Welters for arriving. We are supported by a wonderful board of trustees who really answered the call. And this is certainly an important event. So I want to thank you for coming. Amy Liu, our vice president for the Metropolitan Policy Program, represents us well. We just got back from Birmingham, where Brookings just engaged in a partnership with the city of Birmingham to do this kind of work, along with in a number of other sectors. And so I want to thank you for joining us. And certainly I want to thank David Harshbarger and Jonathan Rothwell. And I really do mean this. They are some of the sharpest minds that this institution has touched, and I owe them a debt of gratitude for certain. I might take them out for drinks, though, to pay that, but we're going to continue to do this work. The gentleman in the back, I wanted to respond that there's a data point that we didn't put up. and it's the $600 billion of assets in majority black, housing assets in majority black neighborhoods that we cited in the report. We need to remember there is strength in majority black neighborhoods. My entire project is about identifying the assets, the strengths, the things that we can leverage for future economic, social, and political growth. Yes, we are devalued in those places, but that's their problem. And I said into a community group in Birmingham, I come from a tradition where we did believe if you have two sticks, you rub those two sticks together and you make fire. That $600 billion is enough to mobilize, to excite, to animate our communities, and we've got to find ways to do that. In closing, I also want to thank a tremendous communication staff here at Brookings. The team has just put together an incredible suite of infographics and interactives and the media, and I really want to thank all of you for doing that work. This is just the beginning. Again, we're looking at housing, but we're going to expand. We're currently working on a business devaluation report as we speak. But again, we are mobilizing. If you're a funder out there, please give me a holla because we have much more work to do. And so, but again, thank you all for coming. You're all part of my crew now. Hit me up on Twitter and follow Brookings Metro. And obviously, download, read the report if you have not already. Again, thank you for coming.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.